At 1:15 in the morning on February 28, 2026, the skies above Iran turned white. Not from lightning, not from any natural phenomenon. What lit up the Persian darkness that night were the exhaust trails of cruise missiles, dozens of them slicing through the atmosphere at subsonic speed, each one pre-programmed to erase a specific coordinate from the face of the Earth. This was not a warning. This was not a signal. This was the opening act of what American commanders would name Operation Epic Fury, the most significant U.S. military campaign in the Middle East in over 2 decades, and the moment the world realized that the long-threatened confrontation between Washington and Tehran had finally irreversibly begun. To understand how we arrived at that night, you have to go back further than most people realize. The architecture of this conflict was not built in weeks or months. It was assembled across decades of broken diplomacy, accelerating uranium enrichment, and a quiet, grinding escalation that most of the world chose not to watch too closely. In 2020, President Trump ordered the assassination of Qasem Soleimani, commander of Iran's Quds Force, in a strike near Baghdad airport. Iran responded with calculated restraint. The regime had learned the art of measured retaliation, enough to signal power, not enough to trigger annihilation. But that calculus, it turned out, had an expiration date. In 2015, under President Obama, a deal called the JCPOA was made that limited Iran's nuclear activities in exchange for easing economic sanctions. In 2018, Trump withdrew from that deal. Iran then began violating its limits, enriching more uranium and moving closer to bomb-making thresholds. The window was narrowing. By early 2026, American intelligence had concluded something deeply alarming. Iran was approximately 2 weeks away from possessing enough highly enriched uranium to construct 10 nuclear devices. The clock was no longer a metaphor. It had become a countdown. On February 25, 2026, Iranian Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi stated that a historic agreement with the United States to avert military conflict was within reach ahead of renewed talks in Geneva. Oman's Foreign Minister Badr al-Busaidi had announced a breakthrough. Iran had reportedly agreed to never stockpile enriched uranium and to accept full IAEA verification. Peace, he said, was within reach. Talks were expected to resume on March the 2nd. They never did. Within 24 hours of the strike's beginning, the attack had resulted in the assassination of Iranian Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei, along with several of his senior aides, and the destruction of numerous military and security installations. The diplomatic door had been open. Someone decided to bomb it shut. In the largest B-2 operational strike in U.S. history, the United States dropped 14 GBU-57 massive ordnance penetrators, the world's largest bunker-buster bomb, on Iran's underground nuclear facilities at Fordow and Natanz. These were not targets you could reach with a fighter jet and a standard munitions load. Fordow was buried beneath a mountain, shielded by meters of reinforced concrete, engineered specifically to survive conventional strikes. The GBU-57, known as the Massive Ordnance Penetrator, or MOP, weighs 30,000 pounds and is designed to punch through 200 feet of earth before detonating. Only the B-2 Spirit stealth bomber could carry it. Only one aircraft in the American inventory could have opened those wounds. And on the night of February 28th, that aircraft did exactly what it was built to do. The operation's objectives, as outlined by President Trump, included destroying Iran's missile and nuclear infrastructure, naval assets, and proxy forces. The scale of what followed was staggering in its ambition and its execution. In less than 4 weeks, U.S. forces struck over 5,500 targets inside Iran. More than 60 Iranian warships were sunk or disabled. Iran's special fleet of 4 advanced Soleimani-class warships was entirely destroyed. The nuclear enrichment sites at Natanz, Fordow, and Isfahan were demolished. What had taken Iran nearly 2 decades to construct was being systematically erased in a matter of days. But this was only the first phase of the campaign. The second phase, the one that would shift the psychological and strategic balance in ways that analysts are still measuring, had not yet begun. For the first weeks of Operation Epic Fury, the American air campaign relied on weapons that did not require their delivery platforms to enter Iranian airspace at all. Early in the campaign, B-52s fired long-range cruise missiles from outside Iranian airspace. This was the cautious geometry of modern warfare. Strike from beyond the reach of the enemy's defenses, let the weapons do the penetrating, and keep your aircraft safe. The B-52 Stratofortress, a Cold War relic that first entered service in the 1950s, is not a stealth aircraft. Its radar cross-section is enormous. Its engines are loud. It was designed for nuclear war against the Soviet Union, not for penetrating the integrated air defenses of a modern, motivated regional power, and so for weeks it stayed at a distance. Then something changed. On March 31, 2026, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, General Dan Kane, confirmed that U.S. forces had begun overland bombing missions over Iran using the B-52H Stratofortress strategic bomber, marking a shift from earlier reliance on precision missile strikes towards sustained, higher-volume bombardment. This announcement was not just a tactical update, it was a declaration, blunt, unmistakable, and historically significant. The B-52, a non-stealth aircraft that military doctrine categorically designates as unsuitable for contested airspace, was now operating freely inside Iran. The message embedded in that single operational fact was more powerful than any press release. Iran's air defenses had not merely been damaged, they had been annihilated. B-52s flying in Iran's airspace shows America's complete air dominance, and guaranteed there are also F-22s and F-35s at high altitude on Overwatch, military analyst Rebecca Grant told Fox News Digital. The B-52 does not fly alone over a battlefield where threats still exist. It is escorted by America's most capable stealth fighters, circling at altitude, sensors, and weapons hot, ready to eliminate any surface-to-air missile system that dares to illuminate a radar. Air and Space Forces reported that the U.S. was switching towards more and more dynamic targets, servicing mobile targets around the battle space, with General Kane noting on March 30th, "Given the increase in air superiority, we've successfully started to conduct the first overland B-52 missions. The buff, big ugly fat fellow, as crews affectionately call it, had become the symbol of a campaign entering its most devastating and decisive phase. What makes the B-52 so lethal in a permissive environment is not any single weapon system. It is volume, endurance, and flexibility operating together. The aircraft can carry up to 70,000 pounds of ordnance and can be retasked in flight, enabling crews to receive updated coordinates and target data while airborne. This capability reduces the time between detection and engagement for time-sensitive targets, as the B-52H effectively functions as a high-capacity delivery node within a larger strike network that includes ISR assets and tactical aircraft. When a mobile missile launcher breaks concealment somewhere in the Iranian highlands, attempting to reposition before a follow-up strike, a B-52 overhead does not need to return to base, reload, and fly back. It circles. It waits, and when the targeting data arrives, it fires. Iran had spent decades investing in mobile, dispersed, survivable military architecture precisely to complicate this kind of campaign. The B-52's on-station endurance was dismantling that strategy one dynamic strike at a time. B-52s were captured taking off from RAF Fairford with JDAMs and JSSMs mounted on their wings, returning the following day without weapons. RAF Fairford, a sprawling American-operated base in Gloucestershire, England, had become one of the most consequential pieces of real estate in the conflict. The Air Force had 8 of its 76 B-52s deployed to Fairford, alongside a significant portion of the B-1 fleet, with 15 of 44 B-1 Lancers staging from England. Nearby, RAF Welford housed a massive prepositioned munitions stockpile. Aircraft rotated through on cycling schedules optimized for sustained operations. This was not a sprint. The infrastructure being assembled pointed towards something more enduring. A campaign with no announced end date, and objectives that stretched far beyond any single target list. The current campaign appeared directed at a broader spectrum of institutional, military, and technological assets associated with Iran's nuclear and missile enterprises. Reports suggested that targets included senior leadership nodes, missile production sites, military installations, administrative hubs, and dual-use scientific research facilities, as well as oil refineries. The strikes on Karg Island deserve particular attention in this context. On March 14th, U.S. forces bombed military installations on Karg Island, a small island off Iran's coast responsible for over 90% of Iran's oil exports. This was not simply a military target. Karg Island was the financial spine of the Islamic Republic. Without oil revenue, the regime could not pay its military, fund its proxies, or sustain the industrial base that fed its missile program. Striking Karg was economic warfare fused with kinetic strategy, an attempt to sever the circulatory system of Iranian state power at the source. Iran did not absorb this campaign in silence. An Iranian drone attack struck Kuwait International Airport's fuel depots, igniting a massive blaze and causing significant damage to fuel storage infrastructure. Iranian-backed forces across the region activated. Hezbollah resumed rocket fire on Israel, claiming it as a defensive act following Khamenei's assassination. Greece sent 2 frigates and 4 F-16 fighter jets to Cyprus, following a Shahed 136 drone strike on RAF Akrotiri, the British military's main base for Middle East operations. The conflict was doing precisely what Tehran's strategists had always intended as their deterrent: spreading, making the cost of action felt not just in Iran, but across the entire region and in financial markets from New York to Tokyo. The Dow Jones Industrial Average lost over 1,000 points near the opening bell in early March. A reported an overnight increase of 11 cents in regular gasoline prices nationwide. Jet fuel prices surged nearly 85% from pre-conflict levels, adding enormous pressure to global aviation. Yet the deeper strategic question hovering over this entire campaign, the one that analysts at every major think tank were grappling with even as the bombs fell, was not whether the United States could destroy Iran's military. That question had been answered. The question was whether destroying Iran's military could destroy Iran's nuclear ambitions. Iran still possesses approximately 400 kilograms of 60% enriched uranium, and the exact location of that nuclear material remains unknown. Unlike Iraq's Osirak reactor in 1981, which Israel destroyed in a single strike and effectively terminated a nascent program, Iran's nuclear enterprise in 2026 is something different entirely. It is mature, it is dispersed, it is embedded in a national consciousness. You can destroy the centrifuges. You cannot bomb away the knowledge of how to build them again. As one analyst noted, within hours, Iranian forces launched simultaneous retaliatory attacks across multiple fronts without waiting for centralized authorization, suggesting pre-delegated response authority, a sign that decapitation strategies face diminishing returns against a regime that has spent months dispersing its command structures. The Islamic Republic had long anticipated the possibility of having its head cut off. It had spent years building a body that could function without one. Whether that architecture would hold under the sustained pressure of Operation Epic Fury, under the weight of B-52 sorties cycling out of England and striking targets across a country the size of Western Europe, remained the defining unknown of the entire conflict. The 2026 U.S.-Israel war against Iran has challenged the fundamental realities that have dictated the last few decades of Middle Eastern history. It has disrupted Iran's internal power dynamics and raised critical questions about regional stability, global energy security, and transnational terrorism. The chain reaction set in motion on February 28th is still unfolding. New governments in Tehran's orbit are recalculating their allegiances. Gulf states that quietly supported the campaign are nervously watching their own skies. Russia has condemned the strikes. China has called for restraint while quietly monitoring every tactical development for lessons applicable to its own future contingencies. The world is being reshaped in real time, and the instrument of that reshaping, at least in this moment, is an 8-engine bomber that first entered service before most of the people it is affecting were born. What we are witnessing over Iran is not simply a military campaign. It is a forced renegotiation of every assumption that has governed the Middle East for the past 40 years. The assumption that Iran was untouchable, that its nuclear program was beyond the reach of coercion, that the axis of resistance it had built could absorb any blow and continue functioning. Those assumptions are burning. The fireballs over Iran are, in this sense, more than explosions. They are punctuation marks at the end of an era. What follows, what Iran becomes in the wake of this campaign, what deal is eventually struck or refused, what power fills the vacuum left by a shattered regime, that is the story that will define the next generation of geopolitics in one of the most consequential regions on Earth. The B-52s are still flying. The outcome is still unwritten.